This is Podcast Theory.
Hello again, fellow podcaster, and welcome back to Podcast Theory. I'm your host, Jason Sircone, and today it is part 4 in our 5-part series of things that your podcast does not need. I highly encourage, once you get done listening to today's episode, to jump back in the archives and listen to the previous 3 episodes of Podcast Theory, because I'm covering some very good items. A lot of this all came together, and really what inspired me on all of this was reading about the attention spans of adults in 2024. And I'll tell you, man, it's scary stuff. I mentioned on the first 3 episodes of this series, 8.25 seconds as of June 2024 as adults. That is where our average attention span falls. So if you do your part to get somebody to click play on your podcast, the last thing you want them to do is bail out because you don't get them to the reason they showed up in the first place. So jump back and listen to those 3 episodes. You're going to learn all about what I mean by that. Today, I'm taking things in a slightly different direction because this is an item that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with attention span, but it's something that I feel as we have evolved in podcasting, this has become less and less of a thing that's needed. So I wanted to make sure it was part of this series because I feel that as we continue to grow our shows and make podcasting more a part of our brand landscapes, we never know where things are going to go. And all I know is I'm looking at how the internet has evolved. I'm looking at how the social media atmosphere has taken over the world and really grabbed hold of society. And I'm looking at overall productions. And what I don't see on a lot of YouTube channels or social media accounts is something that I see a lot of on podcasts. And I think it's time that we start making strides beyond it. And believe me, I've caught some hell on this and had some good debates, nothing real ugly. I know people feel strongly about this, but the 4th thing that your podcast doesn't need is the word podcast in the title. Now, let me eliminate what you're probably saying right now. Is like, dude, your podcast has podcast in the title. It's called Podcast Theory. Yes, that is correct. But what it isn't called is Podcast Theory Podcast or the Podcast Theory Podcast. For one, that's incredibly redundant. And 2, as I sit and record and come to you via video and via podcast in September of 2024, we have become very smart people, attention spans notwithstanding, but we know what we're looking at and we know what we're listening to. And if we're on a podcast app looking for podcasts, more than likely we know what we're going to discover. Wait for it. A podcast. So I don't need to know in the title that it's called podcast or a podcast because I know what I'm searching for. Now, the argument can be made when you have your information out there and it's being discovered through search engine optimization, through Google, through other AI, like maybe Perplexity, things like that. All the ways that you're setting up your podcast to be discovered, perhaps there's that differentiator where it says podcast, okay, you're being literal. But what I was referring to earlier, what I don't see with like a YouTube channel is Mr. Beast YouTube channel. Whatever YouTube channel, whatever Facebook page. We know based on where we are on the internet what we're looking for. So if we're on Facebook and we find Mr. Beast's Facebook page, we know that we're looking at his Facebook page without him saying it's a Facebook page. If I'm looking for a podcast and I discover a show on a podcast app, I know it's a podcast because I know where I'm searching. Even if I find a podcast via Google, via some other type of search engine, I can pretty much determine in the first few seconds if it's a podcast or not. And the reason why I bring this up and why I feel so passionate about it, and maybe this is more of a personal thing, but there's a couple reasons in play. For one, I feel podcasts without the word podcast in the title are more clean and they stand out a little bit more. Think about movies. The Shawshank Redemption movie. That would just be stupid if it said movie at the end. You knew it was a movie and the best movie of all time. That's my call. Feel free to argue. I'll argue that one till I fall off the chair. But nevertheless, it doesn't say movie. Seinfeld, TV show. The Sopranos, TV show. These are all things you know what you're into. You know what you're watching. You know what you're finding. You don't need to be told that it's this. So why are we doing that with podcasts? Again, it just sounds cleaner. Let's go to my other show. Let's Blow This Up, or Let's Blow This Up podcast. I believe Let's Blow This Up sounds much cleaner. And because I'm advertising it as a podcast, you're finding it on podcast platforms. When you find it in other means through search engine optimization, or you find it through my website, it's under the podcast tab. I don't need to reiterate that it's a podcast. Again, just looks cleaner. Now, this is something that I don't know. I'm going to throw this out there. This is pure speculation, but it's 2024. Podcasting has been around 20 years-ish, 20 years and change. Some say even longer, it goes further back. But my understanding is this. Podcasting it first became a thing, and it became popular, at least in regards to the term, quote unquote, podcast, because of iPods. Now, I remember when I got my first iPod, I opened it up after it got it charged up, and I was all fired up to put music on it, and I saw this word podcasts. I was back in 2005, and the first thing I said, what the hell is a podcast? So instinctively, I felt because it was on my iPod that it had to do something with that. So I clicked on it, and there was nothing there. And that was pretty much where I left it. And I didn't do anything with it. I didn't even really learn until a few years later what a podcast actually was. And at that time, if you can go back in time with me, you may be watching this, you may be listening to this going, what the hell is this guy talking about? I've never had to do this. And it's because we've evolved beyond the iPod, and now everything is on our iPhone or our iPad. And we don't have to go through the troubling anguish of plugging our iPod into our computer and downloading music off of iTunes into our iPod so we can take it with us wherever we go. You kids have it so easy these days. But that's what we had to do back in the day when the original iPods first came out. You found the music you wanted. You went to iTunes. You purchased it. You put it on. You plugged into your iPod to your computer, and you put it onto your iPod. And then you could take your music everywhere in this tiny little rectangle. It's pretty sweet. But you could also do the same thing with podcasts. And that was where the original term was born. At least that's how I understand it. If I'm wrong, please feel free to call me wrong on this. But from what I understand, in going back on the timeline, because you were listening to these things on an iPod, it was called a podcast. And it was much like internet radio brought into your ears through your little device that was about the same shape as your iPhone, but it was just for music, and the video ones for videos of movies. Nevertheless, that's where we were 20 years-ish later, 20 years plus later. They're still called podcasts, but iPods are pretty much gone. Now, I know there are probably some people that are still using an iPod. I got the longest life I possibly could out of mine before it finally kicked the bucket. And it was very depressing when that happened because I had so much music stored in that thing. But nevertheless, we moved on to the phone, and we're still listening to it in a podcast type format, but it's not really a pod anymore. In fact, when you say iPod to some younger people, they don't know what you're talking about. Maybe you fall into that classification. Nevertheless, what I'm driving at here, and my main point is someday, maybe, it won't be called a podcast anymore. Purely speculation on my part. I do not know that to be fact. I have not heard anybody else say that. It's just something that I think about. So in addition to your podcast being cleaner without having the word podcast in it, you won't have to make any changes down the road should this industry, should this business decide to call it something else. Again, don't know if that's ever going to happen. So let's lean towards the first one a little bit more, that your title will sound cleaner without the word podcast in it. Or maybe you set yourself up for some success if they do remove that word from our vernacular in the future. like I said, please do not hold me to that. That's just speculation on my part. If this ever becomes true, I will clip the hell out of this particular section of this episode of Podcast Theory, and I will share it and say, see, I was onto something. I've seen some podcasts that have the word podcast in it, but it doesn't really need to be there. And it's there twice. You want to talk about redundant. Now, this show is all about the theory behind podcasting, so podcast theory fits. But I can't remember the full name of the show, but it was something to the effect of a podcast about something podcast. Now, I'll go with the first part, a podcast about XYZ. Okay, that's very on the nose. But you don't need to have the second podcast. If you're telling your listener that it's a podcast about XYZ, I mean, that's about as direct as you can possibly be. You don't need to have another podcast in there. That's from the Department of Redundancy department. It's too much. So you don't need to have the word podcast in your title. If it's in there now, you can start making strides towards removing it if you have an existing show. If you're starting a new show, come up with a clever name that's on brand, that fits your existing brand. Or if you're starting everything from scratch, this is the greatest time in the world because now you can get incredibly creative. I know when I was in that mode with Bombtrack Media, that's how everything came together. When I finally landed on Bombtrack Media as my business name, it wasn't 5 minutes later that I came up with Let's Blow This Up as my first podcast under that umbrella. Podcast Theory already existed as Pod Theory, and I just revamped it as Podcast Theory to bring it back to life. But Let's Blow This Up was on brand, and it allowed me to have something that very much fit along the theme of Bombtrack Media and being explosive with podcast content. So if you're in that phase of things, oh man, are you in a good spot, because that's so fun, because you can be so creative. I'll throw a plug out to Alexandra Watkins, my good friend who helped me with my branding. She has a great book called Hello, My Name is Awesome. I highly recommend you pick that up. In fact, I'll put a link for it in the show notes so you can check out that book. It was Alexandra's tutelage and her book that helped me with the process of naming Bombtrack Media. And when you come up with a cool brand name, all the little ancillary things that go along with that become so much easier because everything stays on brand and it's grabby, it's catchy, it's something that people want to be a part of. But having the word podcast in my podcast never crossed my mind. I never thought about that with Let's Blow This Up. It was just immediately like that was on brand. That was the name. I never even felt the need to have the word podcast in there because, again, going back to what I said before, it was much cleaner to just say, let's blow this up. Now, if I'm explaining it to somebody, I'll say it's a podcast about XYZ. But if you can get to a point where you don't have the word podcast in your title, it's going to stand out. It's going to be a lot cleaner. And again, we're trying to cut through the noise, trying to get in front of the right people. A catchy title is going to do that. And maybe not having the word podcast in it is what attracts a person to that podcast and subsequently your brand as a whole. So keep that in mind. This is very important when you're considering the birth or the launch or the relaunch of a podcast. It doesn't need to have that word in it because we're living in a time where people know what a podcast is. We've come a long way since when it first started, and having that tag on there is not as necessary as it once was. There's going to be a lot of items that you're able to extract from your podcast production that's going to be utilized for SEO, for social media, for emails, for websites, for blogs. All of these items are going to help position your show in the eyes of the right people, and they'll know they're looking for a podcast, or maybe they're not, but they're finding other items that are within your podcast that you've reconstructed and put out there as blogs, social media, et cetera, and whatever it does to grab their attention, that's what matters. You're trying to get people invested in your brand. Your podcast is going to help you create content that does that. And while you're doing it, you don't have to tell people that it's a podcast because they're going to know. We're smarter than we let on sometimes, right? So keep that in mind. Again, will this term ever leave our vocabulary and our vernacular? I don't know. That's pure speculation on my part. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. So let's light up the comment section on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook, as well as just light up my email box. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me what you think. Tell me I'm right, because I'd love to have that type of feedback in my back pocket. But nevertheless, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know what you think in regards to the whole podcasting terminology going away someday. But would also like to hear, do you feel your podcast needs the word podcast in it? Let me know. I'd love to hear what you have to say. That's going to do it for today's episode of Podcast Theory. Tune in for the next episode where I wrap up this series in style with a very important item that you need to hear. It's the final item that your podcast does not need. Now, of course, there's probably more than 5, but at least in this part of the series, it's the last thing that I want you to pay attention to as you bring your podcast to fruition. Until our paths cross again on that episode, I am Jason Sircone. This has been Podcast Theory. Good talk. I will see you out there.